In a small English village in 1847, most folks believed the Duke of Wexford's young son was broken beyond repair. The boy couldn't speak, wouldn't look anyone in the eye, and the whispers said he'd never amount to much. But Amelia Hart, a simple waitress at the Rosewood Inn, saw something different. She saw a child hungry for connection, starving for someone to understand him. When she knelt beside him one autumn afternoon and began moving her hands in the language of signs her late brother had taught her, the room fell silent. The boy's eyes lit up like lanterns. His small hands moved hesitantly at first, then with joy, and his father, the proud Duke, stood frozen in the doorway, watching a common woman do what no governess or tutor ever could. What happens when love refuses to honor the boundaries society has drawn? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Millbrook Village like a whispered secret, reluctant to release its hold on the narrow lanes that wound between timber-framed cottages and stone walls thick with ivy. Amelia Hart rose before dawn, as she had every day for the past 3 years, her worn boots finding their familiar path from the small cottage she shared with her mother to the Rosewood Inn that sat at the village's heart like a beating drum. The inn was already stirring when she arrived, smoke curling from its chimneys into the pale September sky. Mrs. Pemberton, the proprietress, stood in the kitchen with her hands on her substantial hips, surveying the morning's preparations with the sharp eye of a ship's captain. "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberton," Amelia said, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. "Morning, girl. We've got a full house today. That merchant from London is still in room 4, and we've 3 traveling salesmen arrived late last night. They'll want a proper breakfast, not just toast and jam." Amelia nodded, her hands already reaching for the bread that needed slicing. Her fingers moved with the unconscious grace of long practice, though her mind wandered, as it often did in these early hours, to the cottage behind her where her mother lay sleeping. Margaret Hart had been bedridden for nearly a year now, her lungs weakening with each passing season. The doctor's visits had become more frequent, his expression more grave, his bills more impossible to contemplate. "You're thinking too hard again," came a voice beside her. Sarah, the other serving girl, bumped Amelia's shoulder gently. "I can practically hear the wheels turning in your head." Amelia managed a smile. Sarah was younger, barely 18, with bright eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide their hopefulness. "Just planning the day, that's all. Planning or worrying. There's a difference, you know." Sarah reached for the butter dish. "My mam always says worry is like a rocking chair. Gives you something to do but doesn't get you anywhere." The wisdom was simple, perhaps too simple for the complications that weighed on Amelia's shoulders, but she appreciated the kindness behind it. Sarah didn't know about the stack of unpaid bills hidden in Amelia's drawer, didn't understand how thin the margin had become between dating ends meet and losing everything. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Amelia served breakfast to the merchants and salesmen, her movements efficient, her smile polite but not overly familiar. Class distinctions in 1847 England were as rigid as the iron gates that surrounded the great estates, and she had learned long ago where the boundaries lay. A serving girl who forgot her place could find herself without employment, and employment was life itself. By mid-morning the breakfast rush had subsided, and Amelia found herself in the small storage room adjacent to the kitchen, counting linen. It was here, in rare moments of solitude, that she allowed herself to remember. Her fingers paused on a tablecloth, and almost without thinking she reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small leather journal, its cover worn soft with handling. Thomas's journal. Her brother's journal. She opened it carefully, as she always did, treating each page like the precious relic it was. Thomas had been 5 years older, born deaf, in a world that had little patience for difference. Their father, a country blacksmith, had died when Amelia was 7, and their mother had worked herself to exhaustion trying to raise them alone. But Thomas had been special. Where others saw limitation, he had seen possibility. The journal was filled with his careful drawings, hands in various positions, fingers spelling out letters, gestures that meant words, sentences, entire conversations rendered in graceful sketches. He had learned from a traveling scholar who had passed through their village when Thomas was 12, a man who had studied at a school for the deaf in London. For 6 months, Thomas had absorbed everything the scholar could teach him, and then he had created this journal. Determined to share his new language with his little sister, Amelia traced one the drawings with her fingertip, remembering Thomas's patient hands guiding hers, teaching her the shapes and movements. He had been so alive then, so full of determination that the world would understand him. But the fever had taken him 3 years ago, sudden and merciless, leaving behind only this journal and a sister who could speak a language no one else in Millbrook Village understood. "Amelia," Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through her reverie. "We need you in the dining room." She tucked the journal back into her pocket and hurried out, smoothing her apron and fixing her expression into one of pleasant readiness. The dining room was the inn's pride, with its dark oak beams and mullioned windows that looked out onto the village square. Usually it hosted merchants and travelers, the occasional minor gentleman making his way between estates. But today, something was different. She could feel it in the unusual tension that had settled over the staff, in the way Miss Pemberton was fussing with the tablecloths. And Sarah was actually biting her lip with nervousness. "What's happened?" Amelia asked quietly. "The Duke of Wexford," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, though the dining room was still empty. "He's sent word. He'll be arriving this afternoon and staying for a fortnight. He and his son." The words hung in the air like smoke. The Duke of Wexford was one of the most powerful men in the county, his estate sprawling across thousands of acres to the north. But he was also a ghost, a figure more legend than real. He had withdrawn from society 5 years ago when his wife died, rarely venturing from his estate except for necessary business in London. "Why here?" Sarah breathed. "Why not stay at Wexford Hall?" "The hall is being renovated," Miss Pemberton said. "New plumbing, modern conveniences. Apparently the dust and noise are intolerable. He's requested our finest rooms and absolute privacy." Amelia listened as Mrs. Pemberton outlined the preparations required. Fresh linens, the best china, specific dietary requirements. But her mind caught on one detail: his son. The Duke's son was rarely mentioned in village gossip, and when he was, it was in hushed tones, with sidelong glances and uncomfortable shrugs. "Is it true?" Sarah asked, voicing what Amelia was thinking. "About the boy?" Miss Pemberton's expression hardened. "We'll speak no gossip under this roof. The Duke's son has certain difficulties, but he's still a child and deserves our respect. You'll both remember that." The rebuke was gentle but firm. Miss Pemberton was a fair employer, strict but not unkind, and she expected the same decency from her staff that she showed them. Amelia respected her for it. The afternoon transformed the inn into a flurry of activity. Every surface was polished until it gleamed. Fresh flowers were arranged in vases. The best rooms on the second floor were prepared with meticulous care. Amelia found herself checking details twice, 3 times, making sure everything was perfect. She had never served nobility before, and the prospect made her fingers tremble slightly as she arranged the tea service in the private sitting room. The Duke arrived as the church bells struck 4. Amelia watched from the dining room window as the carriage rolled to a stop, its black lacquer finish reflecting the late afternoon sun. A footman in livery jumped down to open the door, and a tall figure emerged. The Duke of Wexford was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His face was angular, handsome in a severe way, with the kind of bearing that came from generations of command. He moved with purpose, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but it was the small figure that followed him that captured Amelia's attention. A boy perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with his father's dark hair but softer features. He climbed down from the carriage carefully, his movements hesitant, and stood close to the Duke's side, his eyes fixed on the ground. "That's him," Sarah whispered beside her. "The son, Edward, I think his name is." Amelia watched as the Duke placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him toward the inn's entrance. The boy moved like a shadow, barely making a sound, and there was something in his careful, withdrawn posture that tugged at something deep in Amelia's chest. She had seen that posture before, in Thomas, when the world had been too loud with its judgment and too quiet with its understanding. Mrs. Pemberton greeted the Duke at the entrance with the perfect balance of deference and dignity. Amelia and Sarah stood at attention in the hallway, ready to assist with whatever might be needed. The Duke's eyes swept over them with the brief, assessing glance of someone used to evaluating servants, then dismissed them just as quickly. "Your rooms are prepared, Your Grace," Miss Pemberton said. "We've given you the East Wing as requested. Complete privacy. Your trunks have already been taken up." "Very good." The Duke's voice was deep, measured, the accent of someone educated at the finest schools. "We'll take dinner in our rooms this evening. My son tires easily." "Of course, Your Grace. Whatever you require." As Mrs. Pemberton led them toward the stairs, young Edward glanced back once, his dark eyes sweeping across the hallway. For just a moment, his gaze met Amelia's, and she saw it. Intelligence, curiosity, loneliness so profound it seemed to radiate from him like cold from winter stones. Then the moment passed, and he turned away, following his father up the stairs. "Well," Sarah breathed, once they had disappeared, "he seems normal enough to me. I don't know what all the fuss is about." But Amelia knew. She had seen the way the boy's lips had remained closed, the way he had communicated nothing to his father except through small movements, slight tugs on the Duke's coat. She had seen the isolation in his eyes, the look of someone trapped behind glass, watching a world he could not quite reach. That evening, as she prepared their dinner tray, Amelia found her thoughts returning again and again to the boy. Mrs. Pemberton had been clear in her instruction. The Duke wanted no interaction, no conversation, just efficient service and then withdrawal. They were not guests to be entertained, but nobility to be accommodated from a respectful distance. She carried the tray up the narrow servants' stairs, her steps careful on the worn treads. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the inn, insulated from the sounds of the tap room below and the other guests. She knocked softly on the sitting-room door. "Enter," came the Duke's voice. The room was handsomely appointed, with a fire crackling in the grate and curtains drawn against the evening chill. The Duke sat at a desk near the window, papers spread before him, a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up briefly as she entered, then returned to his work. "Just set it on the table," he said without preamble. Amelia moved quietly, arranging the dishes as she had been taught, making no unnecessary sound. But as she worked, she became aware of another presence in the room. The boy, Edward, sat in a chair near the fire, a book open in his lap. But he was not reading. He was watching her with that same intense, careful attention she had noticed before. She finished arranging the dinner service and curtsied, preparing to leave. But something made her pause. Perhaps it was the memory of Thomas, sitting alone so many times while others ignored him or spoke about him as if he were not there. Perhaps it was the familiar ache of recognizing isolation and another soul. She met the boy's eyes and smiled, not the polite, distant smile of a servant, but a genuine expression of warmth, of recognition, of seeing him as a person rather than a problem. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she thought she saw the beginning of a smile on his lips. "That will be all," the Duke said, his tone making it clear she had lingered too long. "Yes, Your Grace." Amelia curtsied again and left, but as she closed the door she glanced back once more. Edward was still watching her, and in his eyes she saw a question forming, a tentative reaching out across the distance that separated their worlds. That night, in the cottage she shared with her mother, Amelia sat by candlelight with Thomas's journal open in her lap. She turned the pages slowly, studying the careful drawings of hands forming letters, words, entire sentences without sound. Her mother slept in the next room, her breathing ragged but steady, and in the quiet darkness, Amelia allowed herself to remember Thomas laughing silently as he taught her the sign for mischief. Thomas's face lighting up when she finally mastered a complicated phrase. Thomas's funeral, where everyone spoke words he would never have heard, while she stood silent, her hands still, because there was no one left who would understand their language. The next 3 days passed in careful routine. The Duke and his son kept to themselves, taking meals in their rooms, venturing out only for brief walks in the countryside when the weather permitted. Amelia caught glimpses of them occasionally, the Duke, always formal, always distant, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder, the boy walking beside his father with downcast eyes, seemingly lost in a world of his own making. The village, naturally, buzzed with speculation. In the taproom, voices dropped to whispers whenever the Duke passed through the hallway. Sarah reported the gossip breathlessly during their brief moments in the kitchen. "Mrs. Holbrook says the boy's cursed," she whispered, while kneading bread. "Says his mother died bringing him into the world, and he's been touched by darkness ever since." "That's foolish superstition," Amelia said sharply, more sharply than she intended. Sarah blinked, surprised by the vehemence. "I'm only telling you what people are saying. People say many things. Doesn't make them true." But the gossip continued, as gossip always did in small villages, where excitement was rare and judgment plentiful. The blacksmith's wife claimed the boy was simple-minded. The vicar's daughter suggested he might be possessed. The schoolmaster pontificated about the unfortunate results of aristocratic inbreeding. Each theory was more absurd than the last, and each one made Amelia's jaw tighten with remembered anger. On the 4th day, everything changed. The afternoon had turned grey and wet, rain pattering against the inn's windows with persistent melancholy. Most of the guests had retired to their rooms or gathered in the tap-room, leaving the dining room empty except for the warmth of the fire and the soft tick of the mantel clock. Amelia was setting tables for the evening meal, her movements automatic, when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly, but the absence of one. The quality of silence that comes when someone is trying very hard not to be noticed. She turned and saw young Edward stood just inside the doorway, partially hidden by the heavy oak frame, his small figure tense with the readiness to flee. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that was almost startling, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. For a long moment, neither moved. Amelia held still, instinctively understanding that any sudden motion might send him running like a startled deer. The rain drummed against the windows. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. Then, slowly, deliberately, she smiled. The same genuine smile she had offered him that first evening, the smile that said, "I see you rather than I pity you." The boy took a tentative step into the room, then another. His movements were careful, almost ritualistic, as if he had rehearsed this approach many times in his mind. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to interact, but far enough to maintain escape distance. Amelia set down the napkin she had been folding and straightened, keeping her posture open and non-threatening. She had learned this with Thomas. Never tower over him, never crowd his space. Always let him set the pace of interaction. Edward's hand moved to his pocket and withdrew something. A piece of paper, folded many times until it was small enough to fit in a child's palm. He held it out to her, his arm extended fully, his eyes watching her face with desperate hope. She took it gently, her fingers careful not to brush his, sensing that touch might be too much, too soon. The paper was worn soft from repeated folding and unfolding, and when she opened it she found a drawing, a child's drawing, but executed with surprising skill. It showed two figures, one tall and one small, their hands raised in what could only be gestures, signs. Beneath the drawing, In careful, painstaking letters were words, "Can you teach me more?" Amelia's breath caught. She looked up from the paper to find Edward watching her with such naked vulnerability that it hurt to witness. His small hands moved then, uncertain and clumsy, forming shapes she recognized instantly. The sign for please. He had learned it from somewhere, perhaps from watching servants in his father's house, perhaps from some half-remembered encounter, but he had learned it, and now he was using it. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, or the propriety, or the vast gulf that separated a duke's son from a serving girl, Amelia knelt. She brought herself to his level, eye to eye, and her hands moved in response. Slowly, clearly, she signed, "Yes, I will teach you." The transformation on Edward's face was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. His whole body seemed to unfold from its defensive crouch. His eyes, which had been wary and guarded, suddenly blazed with joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. His hands flew up, attempting to copy her movements, and though they were clumsy and imprecise, the intention was unmistakable. Amelia's heart swelled. She signed again, this time introducing herself properly, in the language Thomas had taught her. Her name, finger-spelled with careful precision. Then she pointed to him, her eyebrows raised in question. His hands spelled out his name in return. Edward. Each letter deliberate, each movement a triumph of effort over isolation. "Edward," she said aloud, and signed simultaneously. "That's a fine name," he smiled then. Not the tentative, almost smile she had seen before, but a full, radiant expression of happiness that transformed his features entirely. He looked like what he was, a child, unburdened for one perfect moment from the weight of being different, of being other, of being alone. The sound of footsteps in the hallway shattered the moment. Edward's smile vanished, replaced instantly by his usual guarded expression. He snatched the drawing from Amelia's hands, stuffed it back into his pocket, and retreated toward the door. But before he disappeared, he turned back once more, his hands moving in a final desperate sign. "Tomorrow?" Amelia nodded, her own hands responding, "Tomorrow." Then he was gone, slipping away like a ghost, and Amelia was left kneeling on the floor of the empty dining room, her heart pounding with something she could not quite name. Fear, perhaps, at what she had just begun. Hope, certainly, for what it might mean for the lonely child upstairs, but also something deeper, something that whispered of consequences and complications she could not yet foresee. The footsteps had been Mrs. Pemberton passing down another corridor, not investigating the dining room at all, but the interruption had served its purpose, reminding Amelia of where she was and who she was. The boundaries that governed her world were not suggestions, but iron laws, and she had just stepped across one of them. That evening, as she lay in bed listening to her mother's labored breathing, Amelia stared at the ceiling and wondered what she had set in motion. Teaching the Duke's son sign language was not in itself a transgression, but doing so in secret, without his father's knowledge or permission, was another matter entirely. The Duke had made his wishes clear: privacy, distance, no unnecessary interaction. Yet how could she refuse the silent plea she had seen in Edward's eyes? How could she turn away from a child who reminded her so much of her brother, who carried the same burden of isolation that Thomas had borne? The world had failed Thomas in so many ways, had made so little space for his difference. Perhaps, with Edward, she could offer something different. Perhaps she could be the bridge he so desperately needed. The decision, she realized, had already been made. The moment she knelt and signed yes, she had committed herself to a path whose end she could not see. The lessons began in stolen moments, fragments of time carved from the margins of Amelia's duties. Early mornings before the breakfast service, when the dining room stood empty and grey with pre-dawn light. Late afternoons during the lull between luncheon and dinner preparations, when most guests napped or took the air. brief encounters in hallways that seemed accidental but were carefully orchestrated through glances and subtle signals. Edward proved to be a remarkable student. His hands, which had been hesitant and uncertain that first day, grew increasingly confident with each lesson. He absorbed signs like parched earth, absorbing rain, his young mind hungry for this language that finally gave shape to the thoughts trapped inside him. Within 3 days he had mastered the alphabet and was forming simple words. Within a week he was constructing full sentences. But it was more than just the mechanics of communication that transformed him. As he learned to express himself, his entire bearing changed. The hunched, defensive posture gradually straightened. The downcast eyes began to lift and meet Amelia's, with directness. The ghost-like silence that had surrounded him was replaced by an animated expressiveness, his face learning to convey what his voice could not. Amelia found herself enchanted by his intelligence. Behind the walls of silence, Edward possessed a keen, observant mind. He asked questions about everything. Why did birds sing? How did rain form in clouds? What made fire hot? His hands flew through the signs, sometimes faster than she could follow, and when she taught him a new concept, she could see his mind working, connecting it to other knowledge, building understanding like an architect constructs a cathedral. She brought Thomas's journal to their 3rd lesson, carrying it tucked beneath her apron like contraband. When she showed it to Edward, his eyes widened with wonder. He touched the drawings reverently, tracing his fingers over Thomas's careful sketches of hand positions and finger shapes. "My brother made this," she signed, finger-spelling Thomas's name. "He was like you." He could not speak with his voice. Edward looked up at her, his expression serious and thoughtful. His hands moved in question. "Where is he now?" "He died," Amelia signed simply. "But he taught me this language before he left. And now I teach you." Something shifted in Edward's face then, a recognition of shared loss, of the weight that comes from loving someone who existed outside the world's easy understanding. His small hand reached out and rested briefly on the journal, a gesture that seemed to say, "I understand," more eloquently than any words could have. But their secret could not remain hidden forever in a place as small and gossip-filled as the Rosewood Inn. Sarah noticed first, though she said nothing initially. Amelia caught her watching once, her eyes curious but not unkind, as Amelia's hands moved almost unconsciously through signs while she worked, practicing phrases she planned to teach Edward. "That's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "The way your hands move, like dancing." Amelia's hands stilled. "It's sign language. My brother used it." "I know. Mrs. Pemberton told me about him once." Sarah paused in her work, her young face thoughtful. "You're teaching the Duke's boy, aren't you?" The denial rose automatically to Amelia's lips, but something in Sarah's expression stopped it. There was no judgment there, no threat of exposure, only understanding and perhaps a touch of admiration. "Yes," Amelia admitted quietly. "Does his father know?" "No." Sarah nodded slowly, returning to her tasks. "He should. The boy's transformed since you arrived. Even Mrs. Pemberton's noticed, though she hasn't said anything. He walks different now, holds his head up." "I know it's not my place," Amelia began, but Sarah shook her head. "Maybe it should be someone's place. That child was drowning in silence, and you threw him a rope. There's no sin in that, no matter what station you were born to." The words were simply spoken, but carried weight. Amelia felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not realized she was carrying. Having an ally, even an unexpected one, made the secret feel less like a burden and more like a shared responsibility. But complications arose from other quarters. The Duke himself had begun to notice the change in his son, though he seemed unable to identify its source. Amelia observed him during the few times their paths crossed, watching as his stern expression softened slightly when Edward entered a room. noting the questions in his eyes when his son met his gaze directly instead of staring at the floor. One evening she was clearing away the dinner service from their sitting room when she overheard them through the partially open door. The Duke's voice carried a note of confusion, almost bewilderment. "You seem different lately, Edward. More present somehow. I wish I understood what goes on in that mind of yours." There was a long pause. Amelia imagined Edward standing there, wanting desperately to respond, his hands perhaps twitching with the signs he now knew, but unable to bridge the gap with his father, who did not speak his language. "The physicians said you might never truly engage with the world," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to something softer, more vulnerable. "They said I should prepare myself for a life of caring for someone who would never quite be here. But I see you watching things now, thinking, I wonder what you would say if you could." Amelia's heart ached. The Duke loved his son. That much was clear in the pain that threaded through his words. But love without understanding was a bridge built only halfway across a chasm, useless for the cross. She made her decision in that moment, though she knew it was reckless and possibly ruinous. She knocked firmly on the doorframe, then entered with the tea tray she had prepared. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Forgive my intrusion, but I wonder if I might speak with you. It concerns your son." The Duke turned, surprise flickering across his features. Servants did not volunteer conversation with nobility. They spoke when spoken to, performed their duties, and faded into the background like living wallpaper. "What about my son?" His tone was guarded, protective. Amelia set down the tea tray and clasped her hands in front of her to stop them from trembling. "Your Grace, Edward is not unable to communicate. He simply communicates differently than most. There is a language of hands and gestures, that allows those who cannot speak to express themselves fully." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "And you know of this language?" "Yes, Your Grace. My late brother was born deaf. He taught it to me, and I have been teaching it to your son." The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. The Duke's face had gone very still, his expression unreadable. Edward, sitting in his chair by the fire, had frozen, his eyes wide with fear and hope in equal measure. "You have been teaching my son," the Duke said slowly, each word carefully measured, "without my knowledge or permission." "Yes, Your Grace." There was no point in denying it or making excuses. "Edward sought me out. He drew me a picture, asking if I could teach him. I could not refuse him." "You could not refuse." The Duke's voice was cold now. The warmth she had heard moments ago vanished completely. "You are a serving girl in an inn. You presume to make decisions regarding the education of a duke's son." Amelia kept her eyes lowered, but her voice remained steady. "I presume only to offer a child a way to speak when he has been silent. Nothing more. Nothing more. Nothing more." The Duke stood, his full height imposing in the small sitting room. "You have overstepped every boundary of propriety and position. You have inserted yourself into matters far beyond your station. Do you understand the audacity of what you have done?" "I understand that your son was drowning in isolation," Amelia said, her voice rising despite herself, "and that he needed someone to see him as more than a problem to be managed or a tragedy to be endured." The Duke's face flushed with anger. "You dare lecture me about my own son? I dare to speak for a child who has no voice." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge that could not be taken back. Amelia braced herself for dismissal, for the fury of an aristocrat whose authority had been questioned by someone so far beneath him. Her employment would end. Miss Pemberton would be apologetic, but firm. There would be no references, no hope of finding similar work. Her mother's care would become impossible. The consequences lined up in her mind like dominoes, each one toppling the next. But the fury she expected did not come. Instead, the Duke's face underwent a transformation. The anger drained away, replaced by something more complicated: confusion, hurt, and beneath it all, a deep, abiding weariness. He sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "You speak as if I have done him harm, as if I have been neglectful." "Not neglectful, Your Grace," Amelia said more gently, but perhaps unaware of what was possible. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice low and raw. "When my wife died, the physicians told me Edward would be better off in an institution, a place where others like him could be cared for by professionals who understood such afflictions. They said keeping him with me was sentiment overruling good judgment." Amelia's throat tightened. She had heard of such places, warehouses for inconvenient souls, where difference was treated as disease and silence was enforced, rather than broken. "I refused," the Duke continued. "He is my son, my only child, but I have watched him grow more distant with each passing year, locked inside himself, and I have wondered if those physicians were right, if my love for him was actually harming him by keeping him in a world he could not navigate." Edward had risen from his chair and now stood beside his father, his small hand resting on the Duke's arm. The gesture was simple but eloquent, comfort offered from child to parent, a reversal of the expected order. The Duke looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "Can he truly communicate, using this language you speak of?" "He can, Your Grace. Watch." Amelia turned to Edward and signed slowly, speaking aloud as her hands moved so the Duke could follow. "Edward, tell your father something you have wanted to say." For a moment, the boy hesitated, caught between old habits of silence and new possibilities of expression. Then his hands began to move, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. His face was alive with concentration and hope. Amelia translated, her voice soft. "He says, 'Father, I love you. I hear everything you say to me. I understand you. I have always understood. I was never lost. I was only waiting for someone to find the right way to reach me.'" The Duke's composure crumbled. His hand reached out and grasped his son's shoulder, then pulled the boy into an embrace so fierce it seemed to contain years of accumulated grief and longing. Edward's arms wrapped around his father's neck, and for a long moment they simply held each other, while Amelia stood witness to a reunion that transcended words. When the Duke finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He looked at Amelia with an expression she could not quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. A reassessment, perhaps, of boundaries he had always taken for granted. "Teach me," he said simply, "teach me this language. I will pay you whatever you ask. I ask nothing, Your Grace, only that you allow me to continue helping Edward. You will be compensated," the Duke said firmly. "This is not charity I am requesting, but a service of immense value. You will teach both of us, Edward and myself, and you will be paid as a tutor would be, properly." Amelia's mind reeled. A tutor's wages would be more than she earned in a month at the inn. It would mean her mother's care secured, the bills paid, perhaps even a small savings against future trouble. But it would also mean greater involvement with the Duke's household, a closer association that could bring its own complications. "I accept, Your Grace," she said, because there was no other answer possible. "But I must continue my duties here as well. My position at the inn." "Of course." The Duke stood, his composure returning though something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. "We will arrange lessons at times that do not interfere with your work." He extended his hand toward her, not in the casual dismissive gesture of nobility to servant, but as one equal to another. After a moment's hesitation, Amelia took it. His grip was firm, warm, and the handshake lasted a fraction longer than propriety dictated. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have given me back my son." As Amelia left the room, her mind spinning with the implications of what had just occurred, she caught Edward's eye. He was grinning, his whole face radiant with triumph and joy. His hands moved in the sign they had practiced. Just that morning. "Friend," she signed back, "always." The news spread through the inn, with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. By the next morning, everyone knew that the Duke had engaged Amelia as a tutor for his son. Mrs. Pemberton called her into the small office behind the kitchen, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "This is quite an opportunity, Amelia," she said, settling her considerable frame into the chair behind her desk. "A chance to better yourself, but you must be careful. The nobility are not like us. Their world operates by different rules, rules that can be treacherous for those who do not understand them fully." "I know, Mrs. Pemberton. I will be careful. See that you are. The Duke seems a fair man, but he is still a Duke, and you are still a serving girl, no matter what wages he pays you. That distance cannot be bridged, no matter how grateful he might be." The warning was kindly meant, but it settled like a stone in Amelia's stomach. Mrs. Pemberton was right, of course. Nothing had truly changed. The chasm between her world and the Duke's remained as wide as ever, even if they now stood on either side speaking the same language on behalf of a child. But over the following days, something unexpected began to develop. The lessons became a shared endeavor. Each afternoon for 2 hours, Amelia would go to the Duke's sitting room, where father and son waited. She had brought Thomas's journal, and they pored over it together, the Duke learning the signs with the same intense focus Edward had shown, though his adult hands were less nimble and required more practice. The Duke proved to be a dedicated student, approaching sign language with the same seriousness he likely brought to estate management or parliamentary affairs. But there were moments when his facade of aristocratic reserve would crack, usually when Edward would sign something particularly witty or insightful, and the Duke would laugh. A genuine, unguarded laugh that transformed his severe features into something warm and approachable. Amelia found herself noticing things about him she had not seen before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the patience in his voice when he struggled with a difficult sign and asked her to demonstrate it again, the tenderness in his expression when he watched Edward practicing, pride and love so evident it was almost painful to witness. And he, she realized with growing unease, had begun to notice her as well, not as a servant, not even quite as a tutor, but as a person. He asked about her life, her family, her late brother. He listened when she spoke, his attention complete and focused in a way that made her acutely aware of herself. He remembered small details from previous conversations and referenced them in later ones, creating a thread of continuity that felt intimate and dangerous. One afternoon, as Edward practiced his letters with fierce concentration, the Duke turned to her and said, quietly, "Your brother was fortunate to have you, to have someone who loved him enough to learn his language rather than demanding he adapt to twos." "Thomas was easy to love," Amelia replied, "just as Edward is, and yet most people never saw past the silence." The Duke's eyes held hers, and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement of shared understanding, of having both loved someone the world deemed less. "Most people do not look closely enough," Amelia said softly. "They see what they expect to see rather than what is actually there." "And what do you see, Miss Hart?" The question hung in the air, weighted with meanings neither of them could safely acknowledge. Amelia felt her heart quicken, felt the dangerous pull of something that had no name and no future. "I see a father who loves his son deeply," she said carefully, "and a man who is willing to change for that love." It was a safe answer, the kind that preserved boundaries and acknowledged nothing beyond the professional relationship they ostensibly shared. But the flicker of disappointment in the Duke's eyes suggested he had hoped for something else, something more honest and more dangerous. Edward looked up from his practice, his hands moving in quick signs. "Father is smiling more. You make him smile." The boy's observation, delivered with childlike directness, broke the tension. Both adults laughed, though the laughter carried an edge of discomfort. Out of the mouths of children, as the saying went, came uncomfortable truths. As autumn deepened into early winter, the dynamic shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Edward's progress was remarkable. Within a month he could hold complex conversations entirely in sign language, his vocabulary expanding daily as Amelia introduced new concepts, and the Duke practiced with him each evening after the lessons ended. The boy had found his voice, and with it his confidence blossomed. But this transformation brought its own complications. Edward began asking questions that neither his father nor Amelia could easily answer. Questions about why other people did not sign, why the world was built for those who could speak and hear, leaving people like him on the margins. Why some children could attend school while he studied alone with tutors. "It is not fair," he signed one afternoon, his small hands emphatic with frustration. "I am not stupid, I can learn, but everyone treats me like I am broken." The Duke's jaw tightened. Amelia could see the pain in his face. The helplessness of a powerful man confronted by an injustice his power could not remedy. England in 1847 had little place for difference, little patience for those who deviated from the expected norm. "You are not broken," Amelia signed firmly. "You are different, and different is not less. But the world thinks it is." Edward's hands replied, his expression older than his years. "Then we must teach the world better," the Duke interjected, his own signing still somewhat clumsy but improving steadily. "And we start by showing them what you can do." It was a bold statement, one that suggested possibilities Amelia had not dared consider. The Duke was proposing not just accommodation of his son's difference, but a challenge to societal attitudes themselves. It was the kind of thinking that could change lives or destroy reputations, depending on how it was received. The village had noticed the changes in Edward. How could they not? The boy who had once walked with his eyes downcast now held his head high. The child who had seemed detached from the world now engaged with it, pointing at things that interested him, his face animated with expressions that communicated what his voice could not. But notice was not the same as understanding, and the gossip that swirled through Millbrook took on a darker tone. Amelia overheard fragments of it in the market, in the church vestibule, whispered in corners when people thought she was not listening. Unnatural. That's what it is, making those strange gestures like some kind of spell casting. The girls put ideas in the Duke's head. Forget her place, she has. Mark my words, no good will come of it. Nobility and common folk mixing like that. It is not how things are meant to be. The criticism stung, but Amelia bore it silently. She had expected disapproval. Change always brought resistance, especially change that threatened established hierarchies. But what troubled her more was the growing tension in her own heart. She was falling in love with the Duke. The realization came to her one evening as she walked home through the frost-touched lanes, her breath misting in the cold air. She had tried to deny it, tried to dismiss the quickening of her pulse, when he entered a room, the warmth that spread through her, when he smiled at something Edward signed. But denial was a dam that could only hold so long against the pressure of truth. It was impossible, of course, absurd even to entertain the thought. He was the Duke of Wexford, a man whose lineage stretched back centuries, whose fortune could buy villages like Millbrook 100 times over. She was a waitress who lived in a 2-room cottage and counted pennies to afford her mother's medicine. The distance between them was not measured in miles, but in the immutable laws of class and breeding. Yet love, she was discovering, paid little attention to such practicalities. It grew where it wished, inconvenient and undeniable, like wildflowers pushing through cobblestones. She suspected, with a mixture of hope and dread, that he felt something similar. The signs were there in the way his gaze lingered on her face when he thought she was not looking, in the careful attention he paid to her comfort during lessons, ensuring she had the best chair, the warmest position near the fire, in the questions he asked that went beyond the merely polite, seeking to understand her thoughts and opinions as if they mattered, as if she were his equal in all but birth. But neither of them spoke of it. To speak would be to acknowledge, and to acknowledge would be to confront an impossibility that was easier left unexamined. Her mother noticed, with the peculiar insight that illness sometimes brings, as if being confined to bed sharpened other senses to compensate. One evening, as Amelia helped her take her medicine, Margaret caught her daughter's hand and held it with surprising strength. "You are careful, are you not?" she asked, her voice rough from the cough that plagued her. "Always, mother, you know I am. I do not speak of carefulness with money or propriety." Margaret's eyes, still sharp despite her body's frailty, fixed on Amelia's face. "I speak of your heart. You have a tender heart, my girl. It has always been your greatest strength and your greatest vulnerability." Amelia felt tears prick at her eyes. "I know my place, mother. Knowing and accepting are different things." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "I see how you speak of him, of them both, father and son. There is a light in your eyes that has been absent since Thomas died. It gladdens me to see it, truly. But lights can burn as well as warm." "Nothing can come of it," Amelia whispered. "I am not foolish enough to imagine otherwise. Love is always foolish, child. That is its nature. But you must protect yourself nonetheless. The nobility take what they want and move on. We are the ones left to pick up the pieces." The warning echoed Mrs. Pemberton's, spoken from the hard wisdom of those who understood their place in the world's hierarchy. Amelia knew they were right. She knew she should guard her heart more carefully, maintain a professional distance, remember always the gulf that separated her world from the Duke's. But knowledge and ability were not the same thing. Each afternoon, when she entered that sitting room and saw him bent over Thomas's journal with Edward, both of them signing to each other with increasing fluency, her heart betrayed her careful resolution. Each time he smiled at her in that unguarded way that transformed his aristocratic features, she felt the walls she tried to build crumbling to dust. The first snow came in mid-November, transforming Millbrook into a scene from a painted Christmas card. Edward was enchanted. He stood at the window of the sitting room, his hands pressed against the glass, watching the flakes fall with the wonder only a child can muster. His hands moved in excited signs, describing the snow's dance, comparing it to feathers, to petals, to stars descending from heaven. "He has the soul of a poet," the Duke said softly, standing beside Amelia, as they watched the boy. "I never knew. All these years, I never knew what was inside him." "You know now," Amelia replied. "That is what matters. Because of you." He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You have given me the greatest gift one person can give another. You have shown me my own son. I only provided the language, Your Grace. Edward did the rest. Do not diminish what you have done." His voice was low, meant for her ears alone. "You could have ignored him, as everyone else did. You could have kept your distance, maintained your position, but you knelt down and spoke to a lonely child in the language he needed. That took courage, Miss Hart, and compassion of a kind rarely found in any station of life." The formality of Miss Hart felt like a lie between them now, a polite fiction they maintained for propriety's sake. But the way he said it, soft and weighted with unspoken meaning, transformed it into something almost intimate. "Your Grace," she began, intending to deflect, to restore the proper distance between them. "Alexander," he said quietly, "my name is Alexander. I would like you to use it at least here, in this room, when it is just us and Edward." The request was shocking in its informality, a breach of every social convention that governed their interactions. To use a duke's Christian name was a privilege reserved for family and close friends of equal rank, not for serving girls hired as tutors. "I could not possibly, please." The single word carried a weight of longing that made her throat tighten. "I am weary of walls, Amelia, of the barriers we erect between ourselves and those who matter. You have torn down the walls around my son. Must there be walls between us as well?" He had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice, spoken with such quiet intensity, sent warmth flooding through her. It was dangerous, this dissolution of formality. It was the first step toward something that could only end in ruin. but she could not find the strength to refuse him. "Alexander," she whispered, testing the name on her tongue. It felt illicit and thrilling, like stealing something precious. His eyes closed briefly, as if the sound caused him pain or pleasure or both. When he opened them again, she saw in their depths a reflection of her own impossible longing. Edward chose that moment to turn from the window, his hands flying in excited signs about building a snowman, oblivious to the charged atmosphere between the adults. The spell broke, and both Amelia and Alexander stepped back from the precipice they had been approaching, retreating to safer ground. But something had shifted irrevocably. A line had been crossed, and there was no uncrossing it. The following days brought a new awkwardness to their lesson. They were exquisitely polite to each other, scrupulously proper, yet the very effort of maintaining propriety only highlighted what they were trying to suppress. Their hands would brush accidentally when reaching for the same book, and both would pull back as if burned. Their eyes would meet across the room, and one or the other would quickly look away, color rising in their cheeks. Edward, perceptive as always, noticed the change. His hands signed a question. One afternoon, "Why do you and father act strange now?" Amelia felt heat flood her face. "We do not act strange. You do," Edward insisted, his expression knowing beyond his years. "You look at each other and then look away quickly, like you are afraid." "We are not afraid," she signed, though the lie tasted bitter. "You should not be afraid," Edward continued with the simple wisdom of children. "Father is happier when you are here. So am I. Why would that be frightening?" Why indeed? The question was innocent, but it cut to the heart of the matter. In a just world, happiness would be reason enough. In a just world, two people who brought joy to each other's lives would be free to explore that connection without consideration of birth or fortune. But the world was not just, and never had been. Before Amelia could formulate a response, the door to the sitting room opened without warning. Miss Pemberton stood in the doorway, her face grave, and behind her was a woman Amelia had never seen before. Tall and elegantly dressed, with dark hair styled in the latest London fashion, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of nobility. "Your Grace," Miss Pemberton said, her voice tight with discomfort. "Lady Catherine Ashford has arrived. She says she is your sister." The Duke rose swiftly, his expression transforming from the warmth Amelia had grown accustomed to into something distant and formal. "Catherine, this is unexpected." "Clearly," Lady Catherine said, her sharp eyes sweeping the room, taking in the cozy scene with Edward, the scattered papers covered in sign language diagrams, and most particularly, Amelia herself. "I received your letters about Edward's progress," Lady Catherine continued, moving into the room with the confidence of one accustomed to owning whatever space she occupied. "I confess, I found the claims somewhat difficult to credit. A serving girl teaching him some manner of hand gesture." It sounded like desperation speaking. "Alexander. So I came to see for myself." The dismissiveness in her tone made Amelia's spine stiffen. She recognized the type immediately. Lady Catherine was a woman who measured worth by title and fortune, who saw the world in strict hierarchies and felt threatened by anything that challenged those divisions. "It is not mere hand gestures," the Duke said, his voice cool. "It is a complete language, as sophisticated as any spoken tongue, and Miss Hart is not merely a serving girl. She is Edward's tutor, and she has accomplished what a parade of expensive governesses and specialists could not." "How progressive of you," Lady Catherine said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She turned to Edward, who had pressed himself against his father's side, his earlier joy replaced by wariness. "And you, nephew, show me these miraculous gestures I have heard so much about." There was a challenge in her tone, a skepticism that expected to be proven right. Edward looked to his father, then to Amelia, uncertainty clear in his expression. Amelia knelt beside him, her hands moving in gentle encouragement. "Show your aunt what you can do. Tell her something you want her to know." Edward hesitated, then his hands began to move. His signs were deliberate, carefully formed, his face serious with concentration. I am not broken. I can think and learn like anyone. I just speak differently. Amelia translated aloud, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the room. Lady Catherine's eyebrows rose. He said all that, with his hands. He did, the Duke confirmed. Edward is highly intelligent, Catherine. He always has been. We simply did not know how to reach him, until Miss Hart showed us the way. For a moment something shifted in Lady Catherine's expression. Surprise, perhaps even respect. But it was quickly shuttered, replaced by the calculating look Amelia was beginning to recognize as habitual. Remarkable, Lady Catherine said. Truly, but Alexander, surely you see the impropriety of this arrangement. A young woman, spending hours alone with you in your private quarters. The gossip must be extraordinary. We are teaching Edward, the Duke said flatly. There is nothing improper about education. Education, yes, but appearances matter, brother. Particularly for someone in your position, you are a duke, not some rural squire. Your actions affect not just yourself, but the family name, the title, everything our ancestors built. She turned her penetrating gaze on Amelia. I mean no offense to you, Miss Hart. I am certain you are a perfectly respectable young woman. But you must understand that the connection between yourself and my brother appears questionable to those who do not know the full situation. Then perhaps those people should concern themselves less with appearances and more with the truth, Amelia said, her voice quiet but firm. The silence that followed was profound. Servants did not speak so directly to nobility, particularly not to correct them. Amelia knew she had overstepped, knew she should lower her eyes and apologize, but something in her refused to back down, refused to pretend that Lady Catherine's concern was anything other than snobbery wrapped in the language of propriety. Lady Catherine's eyes narrowed. You are bold, Miss Hart, bold in a way that suggests you have forgotten your place. Catherine, that is enough, the Duke said, his voice carrying an edge of warning. Is it? Because from where I stand it appears you have forgotten as well. The way you look at this girl. Alexander, the familiarity I sense between you. Do you think I am blind? The Duke's jaw tightened. You overstep. I protect our family, as is my duty, since you seem to have lost sight of yours. Lady Catherine gathered her skirts, preparing to sweep from the room. I will be staying in the village for the next week. We will discuss this matter further, and more privately. Miss Hart, I am certain you have duties to attend to elsewhere. It was a dismissal, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone certain of their authority. Amelia curtsied, the gesture stiff with suppressed anger, and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, Edward's hand caught hers. His fingers were small and warm, and when she looked down at him, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. His hands moved in frantic signs. Do not let her send you away. Please, I need you. The plea broke her heart. Amelia knelt and signed back, aware of both adults watching. I am not going anywhere, I promise. You cannot promise that, Lady Catherine said coldly. You are not in a position to make promises to this child. Amelia rose slowly, meeting the other woman's gaze with quiet dignity. With respect, my lady, I am in exactly the position to make that promise. I am his tutor, employed by his father, and I will continue to serve in that capacity as long as I am wanted. She left before anyone could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just made an enemy of the Duke's sister, and in doing so, likely sealed her own fate. But she could not have done otherwise. Edward's desperate plea had stripped away all her careful caution, revealing the fierce protectiveness she felt for the boy. The following days were tense with unspoken conflict. Lady Catherine took rooms at the inn, her presence a constant reminder of the scrutiny under which they now operated. She appeared at odd times, seeming to materialize in hallways and doorways, her sharp eyes cataloguing every interaction between Amelia and the Duke. The lessons continued, but the ease that had developed between them was gone, replaced by stiff formality and careful distance. Edward suffered most from the change. His progress, which had been remarkable, slowed as tension infected even their teaching sessions. His signs became hesitant again, his confidence eroding under his aunt's critical observation. It was Sarah who brought Amelia the news that would change everything. She found Amelia in the linen closet, folding tablecloths with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. "You need to hear this," Sarah said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to ensure they were alone. "I overheard Lady Catherine talking with Mrs. Pemberton this morning. She is trying to convince the Duke to send Edward away." Amelia's hands stilled. "Send him where?" "To a school. A special school in London for children with affliction. She says it is for his own good, that he needs to be with others like himself, that the Duke is being selfish keeping him here." Sarah's young face was troubled, but from what she was saying, it sounds more like an institution. A place to hide children who embarrass their families. The blood drained from Amelia's face. She had heard of such places. Asylums disguised as schools, where inconvenient children were warehoused out of sight. Thomas had narrowly escaped such a fate, their mother fighting tooth and nail to keep him home, despite recommendations from so-called experts who insisted institutional care was best. The Duke would never agree to that, Amelia said, but even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. Lady Catherine was family, someone whose opinion would carry weight, and she was skilled in the language of aristocratic duty, of obligations to the family name. Could she persuade the Duke that sending Edward away was the responsible choice? "There is more," Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Lady Catherine is spreading rumors about you and the Duke. She is telling people that the situation here is improper, that you have designs on him, that you are using Edward to ingratiate yourself with his father." The accusation was so absurd, so viciously unfair, that Amelia almost laughed. Almost. But the reality of such gossip, in a village like Millbrook, was no laughing matter. Reputations once damaged were nearly impossible to repair, and a serving girl accused of scheming above her station would find herself unemployable, unmarriageable, cast out from respectable society. "Why would she do this?" Amelia whispered. "What have I done to her?" "You have done nothing," Sarah said firmly, "except make the Duke happy, except give his son a voice. Some people cannot abide seeing others find joy, especially when it challenges the order they believe should exist." That evening, as Amelia walked home through the twilight, she felt the weight of hostile eyes following her. Miss Holbrook, the blacksmith's wife, turned her back pointedly as Amelia passed. The vicar's daughter whispered something to her companion, both of them glancing Amelia's way with expressions of smug disapproval. Even Miss Thornton, who ran the general store and had always greeted her cheerfully, merely nodded with cool politeness. Lady Catherine's poison was working. The village that had been her home all her life was turning against her, transforming her from neighbor to pariah, with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Her mother was waiting up, despite the late hour, propped against pillows, her face drawn with concern. "The rumors have reached even here," Margaret said, without preamble. "Mrs. Davies came by this afternoon, ostensibly to bring soup, but really to fish for information. She asked if you had taken leave of your senses, throwing yourself at a Duke." "I have done no such thing," Amelia said wearily, sinking into the chair beside her mother's bed. "I know that, child, but truth matters little when lies are more entertaining." Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. "You must end this. Give up the tutoring position. Distance yourself from the Duke and his son. Your reputation cannot survive much more damage. And what of Edward? Who will teach him if I walk away? His father will find someone else, someone more appropriate to his station. There is no one else in Millbrook who knows sign language, and bringing in a stranger from London would take weeks. perhaps months. In that time, Lady Catherine might succeed in sending him away to that institution. Margaret's grip tightened. That boy is not your responsibility, Amelia. Your first duty is to yourself, to your own future. What good will you be to anyone if you are ruined beyond redemption? The words were harsh, but spoken from love, from the desperate desire of a dying woman to secure her daughter's future. Before it was too late, Amelia knew her mother was right, knew that the sensible course was to retreat, to salvage what remained of her reputation. But sense and heart rarely traveled the same path. I cannot abandon him, Amelia said simply. I cannot be one more person who turns away from a child who needs help because it is inconvenient or improper. Margaret closed her eyes, her face a mask of grief and resignation. You have your father's stubborn heart. It will be your making or your ruin, perhaps both. The crisis came 2 days later, arriving with the force of a winter storm. Amelia was in the kitchen helping prepare the midday meal when Mrs. Pemberton summoned her to the office. The Duke stood there, his face haggard, his usual composure shattered. "Edward is gone," he said without preamble. "He disappeared sometime during the night. We have searched the inn, the grounds, everywhere. He is nowhere to be found." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Amelia's feet. Gone? But how? Where could he go? I do not know. He left no note, no indication of his intentions. The Duke's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Catherine and I argued last night, badly. She insisted I make arrangements for the London school, and Edward was in the next room. He must have heard everything. He must have thought I was going to send him away. Were you? Amelia asked, needing to know, despite the urgency of the moment. No, never. But Catherine was relentless, and I lost my temper. I said things I should not have said, and Edward heard only conflict, only the possibility of being cast aside. The Duke's voice broke. He thinks I am going to abandon him, and now he has run away, and it is winter, and he is alone. The implications were terrifying. A small boy, unable to call for help, even if he hates someone, wandering the countryside in December cold. How long could he survive? Where would he go? He trusts you, the Duke said, gripping Amelia's shoulders with desperate intensity. If anyone can find him, bring him back. It is you. Please, help me find my son. Amelia met his eyes and saw in them a reflection of her own fear, her own fear, her own fierce determination. We will find him, she said. I promise you, we will bring him home. Within the hour, a search party had been organized, the Duke's footmen, several villagers willing to help despite the gossip, and Amelia herself spread out across Millbrook and the surrounding countryside. The afternoon was grey and cold, threatening snow, and every passing minute increased the danger Edward faced. Amelia moved through the village streets with purpose, her mind racing through possibilities. Where would a frightened child go? Somewhere familiar, perhaps, or somewhere that offered comfort. She thought of Thomas, of the times he had retreated when the world became too much. He had always sought out quiet places, spaces where he could be alone with his thoughts. The old mill, the realization struck her with sudden clarity. The abandoned mill on the edge of the village, with its crumbling walls and quiet isolation. Edward had asked about it during one of their walks, his hands signing questions about its history, its purpose. She had told him it had once ground grain for the whole village, but had fallen into disuse years ago. She changed direction, hurrying toward the outskirts of town. The mill sat beside a half-frozen stream, its wheels still and silent, its windows dark hollows in the stone walls. Snow had begun to fall, light flakes that caught in her hair and melted on her cheeks. "Edward," she called, though she knew he could not hear her. She pushed open the warped wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dim and cold, smelling of damp stone and decay. Old machinery cast strange shadows in the failing light. At first she saw nothing, and despair began to creep in. But then she caught movement in the corner, a small figure huddled beneath a tattered piece of canvas. "Edward," she breathed, rushing toward him. He looked up at her approach, his face streaked with tears, his small body shaking with cold. When he saw her, relief and shame warred in his expression. His hands moved in shaky signs. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." Amelia dropped to her knees beside him, pulling off her cloak and wrapping it around his shoulders. Her hands signed as she spoke aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "You are safe now. That is all that matters. But Edward, why did you run? Why did you not come to me, or your father?" His hands trembled as they formed the signs. "I heard them arguing. Aunt Catherine said I should be sent away, that I am an embarrassment. That father keeps me only out of misplaced sentiment. She said there is a school that takes children like me, children who are broken." "You are not broken," Amelia signed fiercely. "How many times must I tell you? You are different, and different is beautiful." But father did not argue with her, not really. He was angry, but he did not say no. He did not say he would keep me. Edward's face crumpled. "I thought if I left, it would be easier for everyone. They could send me away and not feel guilty about it." The child's logic was heartbreaking in its misguided selflessness. Amelia pulled him into her arms, feeling his small body shake with sobs against her shoulder. She held him tightly, one hand stroking his hair, while the other continued to sign against his back. Words of comfort and reassurance. "Your father loves you more than anything in this world," she signed when he had calmed enough to pay attention. "The argument you heard was him fighting for you, not agreeing to send you away. He was angry because your aunt will not see what is obvious to anyone with eyes, that you are extraordinary." "He loves me?" Edward's signs were hesitant, wanting to believe but afraid of disappointment. "He loves you with his whole heart. And he is terrified right now, searching everywhere for you, blaming himself for making you feel unwanted." Amelia cupped the boy's face gently. "We need to get you home. We need to show him you are safe." Edward nodded, though reluctance still shadowed his features. Amelia stood, keeping her cloak wrapped around him, and offered her hand. He took it, his fingers small and cold in hers. They emerged from the mill into a world transformed by snow. What had been light flurries had intensified into a proper snowfall, thick flakes swirling in the wind. Visibility was already diminishing, and Amelia realized with growing concern that the walk back to the village would be more difficult than she had anticipated. Edward pressed close to her side, his free hand clutching her cloak. His teeth chattered despite the wool wrapped around him, and Amelia knew he had been exposed to the cold for too long. They needed to get him warm quickly, but the inn was at least 20 minutes away, longer in these conditions. Her cottage was closer, just across the stream and through the small wood. Her mother would be there, and though the house was modest, it had a good fire and warm blankets. They could send word to the Duke once Edward was safe and dry. She changed course, guiding Edward toward the narrow bridge that crossed the stream. The water below ran dark and swift, not yet frozen despite the cold. The bridge was old, its wooden planks worn smooth by decades of use, and the snow was making them treacherous. "Careful," Amelia signed, though Edward could not see her hands while they navigated the crossing. She kept her grip firm on his, moving slowly, testing each plank before trusting it with their weight. They were halfway across when she heard it. Hoofbeats, muffled by snow but unmistakable, approaching at speed. She turned to see a rider emerging from the swirling white, and even at a distance, she recognized the dark coat and commanding posture. The Duke had found them. He pulled his horse to a halt at the bridge's entrance, dismounting in one fluid motion. His face was a landscape of emotion, relief so profound it was almost painful to witness, anger born of fear, and beneath it all, love so fierce it seemed to illuminate him from within. He crossed the bridge in long strides, heedless of the snow-slick planks, and dropped to his knees before his son. His hands, which had become so practiced at signing over the past weeks, moved with urgent precision. "Edward, thank God you are safe." The boy stared at his father, then his composure broke entirely. He threw himself into the Duke's arms, his small body racked with sobs. The Duke held him as if he would never let go, his own face buried in his son's hair, his shoulders shaking. Amelia stepped back, giving them space for this reunion, her own eyes burning with tears. The snow continued to fall around them, soft and silent, a curtain of white that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. When the first storm of emotion had passed, the Duke pulled back enough to sign to Edward, his movements deliberate and clear despite the cold that must have numbed his fingers. "I will never send you away, never. You are my son, my greatest treasure. Whatever your aunt said, whatever you heard, know this, you belong with me, always. There is no school, no institution, no force on earth that could make me part from you." Edward's hands moved in response, his signs shaky but readable. "But Aunt Catherine said I am an embarrassment, that I bring shame to the family name. Your Aunt Catherine is wrong." The Duke's signs were sharp with conviction. "You bring me nothing but pride, pride in your intelligence, your courage, your kind heart. Any shame belongs to those who cannot see your worth, not to you." "But the world thinks I am broken," Edward signed. "Then the world is blind, and I care nothing for its opinion." The Duke cupped his son's face gently. "You are perfect exactly as you are. Do you understand me? Perfect." The word hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Edward nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted. The fear and doubt that had driven him to run began to recede, replaced by the tentative return of security. The Duke stood, lifting Edward in his arms despite the boy's size, and turned to Amelia. His eyes met hers, and in that gaze was everything he could not say aloud. Gratitude for finding his son, recognition of the bond they share, and something deeper, something that made her breath catch despite the cold. "You found him," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You knew where to look when no one else did." "I know what it is to need refuge," Amelia replied softly. "To need a quiet place when the world becomes too loud." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You have given me more than I can ever repay. Not just finding him now, but finding him weeks ago when everyone else had given up. You saw him when he was invisible to the rest of the world." The intimacy of the moment was broken by Edward shivering violently in his father's arms. Practical concerns reasserted themselves, and Amelia gestured toward the path leading to her cottage. "He needs warmth immediately. My cottage is just through those trees. It is closer than the inn." The Duke did not hesitate. "Lead the way." They moved quickly through the snow-covered wood, Amelia in front breaking a path. The Duke following with Edward held securely against his chest. The cottage appeared through the trees like a haven, smoke curling from its chimney, candlelight glowing warmly in the windows. Margaret was at the door before they reached it, her frail body wrapped in shawls, her face lined with concern that transformed to shock when she saw the Duke. "Your Grace," she breathed. Then her eyes fell on Edward, and maternal instinct overrode all considerations of rank. "Bring the child inside at once. He is half frozen." Within minutes, Edward was wrapped in blankets before the fire, hot tea pressed into his hands. Margaret moved with surprising efficiency despite her illness, heating bricks to warm his feet, bringing out every spare quilt the cottage possessed. The Duke knelt beside his son, never taking his eyes from the boy's face, as if afraid he might disappear again if unwatched. Amelia stood by the window, ostensibly watching the storm, but really giving them space. Her mother caught her eye and gestured toward the small kitchen. In the relative privacy of that cramped space, Margaret spoke in low, urgent tones. "The Duke is in our cottage, in our home. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? How dangerous? He needed shelter. His son needed warmth, and now he has it. But Amelia, when this storm passes and you all return to the village, there will be more talk, more speculation. A duke in a serving girl's cottage, unchaperoned. Lady Catherine will use this. She will twist it into something sordid. Let her try, Amelia said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I am tired of living in fear of gossip. I did what was right. I found a lost child and brought him to safety. If society finds that scandalous, then society is beyond reason. Margaret studied her daughter's face, and something like resignation crossed her features. You love him. The Duke. You love him. It was not a question. Amelia opened her mouth to deny it, to laugh it off as absurd, but the words would not come. In the presence of her mother's knowing gaze, pretense crumbled. Yes, she whispered. God help me. Yes. Does he love you? It does not matter. Nothing can come of it. That was not what I asked. Amelia closed her eyes. I think he might. But he is a duke, mother. A duke, and I am a waitress who lives in a cottage with a leaking roof. There is no story where this ends well. Perhaps, Margaret said softly. Or perhaps the story is not yet finished, and the ending will surprise us both. Before Amelia could respond, the Duke appeared in the doorway. His presence seemed to fill the small kitchen, and Amelia was suddenly aware of how cramped and shabby their home must appear to him. The worn floorboards, the patched curtains, the simple furnishings that were all they could afford. But if he noticed the poverty of their surroundings, his face showed no judgment. Instead, his expression was grave, with purpose. Miss Hart, Mrs. Hart, I must speak with you both. What I have to say concerns all of our futures. Margaret gestured to the small table, and they sat, the three of them crowded into the kitchen while Edward dozed by the fire in the next room. The Duke folded his hands on the scarred wooden surface, and when he spoke, his voice was low but steady. My sister has made her position clear. She believes my association with Miss Hart is improper and damaging to the family reputation. She intends to force my hand by making life untenable for all of us if I do not dismiss Miss Hart and send Edward to the London school. Amelia's heart sank, but she kept her face composed. This was the ending she had expected all along. I understand, Your Grace, Amelia said quietly, proud that her voice did not waver. You must do what is best for your son and your family. I will not make this difficult. You misunderstand me. The Duke leaned forward, his eyes intense. I did not come here to dismiss you. I came here to ask you a question, though I have no right to ask it, and you have every right to refuse. Amelia's breath caught. Margaret's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tightly. My sister is correct about one thing, the Duke continued. The current situation is untenable. The gossip, the speculation, the constant scrutiny. It damages all of us, but particularly you, Miss Hart. Your reputation suffers while mine remains largely intact, because society forgives nobility its transgressions, while punishing those of lesser station mercilessly. I knew the risks when I agreed to teach Edward, Amelia said. Perhaps, but you should not have to bear those risks alone. And there is a solution, though it is radical and will cause its own scandal. He paused, seeming to gather his courage. Miss Hart, Amelia, I am asking you to marry me. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Margaret's grip on Amelia's hand became almost painful. Amelia stared at the Duke, certain she had misheard, that the storm and stress had caused her to imagine words that could not possibly have been spoken. I know this is sudden, the Duke continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to say them all before courage failed. I know the difference in our stations makes this seem impossible, but I have spent weeks watching you transform my son's life, watching you give him confidence and joy he has never known. I have seen your kindness, your intelligence, your unwavering integrity, and I have come to realize that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Your Grace, Amelia managed, her voice barely above a whisper. You cannot mean this. I have never meant anything more in my life. His hand reached across the table, palm up, an offering. I am not asking you to be my mistress or some shameful secret. I am asking you to be my wife, my Duchess, Edward's mother in all the ways that matter. The scandal would be extraordinary, Margaret interjected, her practical nature reasserting itself, despite the shock. A duke marrying a serving girl, the Tun would never accept it. Your family would disown you. Let them, the Duke said with quiet ferocity. I have spent my entire life doing what was expected, following rules written by people who valued title over character, bloodlines over humanity. My first marriage was arranged, suitable in every way society demanded, and it was cold and empty. I will not make that mistake again. I will not sacrifice happiness for propriety. But Edward, Amelia said, her mind reeling, this would affect him too. The stigma of having a common-born stepmother, the whispers, the exclusion from certain circles. Edward adores you. He would gain a mother who understands him, who speaks his language literally and figuratively. As for society's opinion, I care far less about that than I do about my son's happiness. And my own. The Duke's eyes held hers, and Amelia saw in them a vulnerability that took her breath away. This powerful man, this Duke who commanded estates and influenced parliaments, was offering her his heart with the same tentative hope a young boy might show when presenting a girl with wildflowers. I love you, he said simply. I did not plan to. I certainly did not expect to. But somewhere between watching you kneel to speak with my son and seeing you brave my sister's wrath to defend him, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you. The question is whether you could possibly feel the same for me. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. Her whole life had been spent knowing her place, accepting the limitations of her birth, never daring to want what was beyond her reach. And now here sat a duke, in her shabby cottage, asking her to step into a world she had never imagined belonging to. I love you too, she whispered, the words breaking free like birds released from a cage. I have tried so hard not to. I have told myself it was impossible, that nothing could come of it. But yes, I love you. I love your dedication to Edward. I love the way you have learned to see the world through different eyes. I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you make me feel seen. The Duke's face transformed, years seeming to fall away, as joy replaced the tension that had marked his features. He stood, pulling Amelia to her feet, and took both her hands in his. Then marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you that you made the right choice. Let me give you the life you deserve. I have to know, Amelia said, needing to voice the fear that clawed at her heart. What if you come to regret this? What if the reality of society's judgment becomes too much? What if you wake one day and realize you have made a terrible mistake? His hands tightened on hers. I have made many mistakes in my life, Amelia. Marrying you will not be one of them. Of this I am more certain than anything. Your sister will fight this with everything she has. Let her fight. She has no power over my choices. I am Edward's father and guardian. I control the estate. Catherine's approval, while it would be pleasant, is not required. Margaret cleared her throat softly. Forgive an old woman's bluntness, Your Grace, but my daughter deserves honesty. What will this marriage cost her? Not in scandal. We have already discussed that. But in practical terms. Will she be welcomed in your world? Will your peers accept her, or will she spend her life on the margins, tolerated but never embraced? The Duke turned to Margaret, his expression serious and respectful. I will not lie to you, Mrs. Hart. There will be those who refuse to accept Amelia. Doors that would have opened for a duchess of proper pedigree will remain closed. Invitations will be declined, snubs delivered with polite cruelty. It will be difficult at times. Then why ask her to endure it? Margaret challenged, because despite those difficulties, she will have more agency and protection as my wife than she would ever have as a serving girl. Because together we can create our own society, surround ourselves with people who value character over class. Because Edward needs her, and I need her, and I believe she needs us as well. He paused. And because I think your daughter is brave enough to face whatever challenges come, if she believes the cause is worth fighting for. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You see her clearly. That is good. Too many men see only what they wish to see in a woman, then resent her when reality fails to match their fantasies. I see Amelia exactly as she is, the Duke said quietly. Strong, compassionate, intelligent, and far too good for someone like me. But I am selfish enough to ask her to overlook that fact. Despite the gravity of the moment, Amelia felt laughter bubble up. You are a duke proposing to a waitress. I think if anyone is overlooking facts, it is you. Then we are a matched pair of fools, he said, and the warmth in his voice made her heart soar. Will you be a fool with me, Amelia? Will you marry me and face whatever comes together? She looked at her mother, seeking guidance, or permission, or perhaps simply witness. Margaret's eyes were bright with tears, but she smiled and nodded once. Then Amelia looked toward the main room where Edward slept peacefully before the fire. The child who had brought them together, whose need for understanding had bridged the impossible gap between their worlds. Yes, she said, the word emerging strong and sure. Yes, I will marry you. The Duke pulled her into his arms, and she felt his heart hammering against her chest, as rapid and uncertain as her own. They stood there in the tiny kitchen of her cottage, holding each other while the storm raged outside, and Margaret wept quietly into her handkerchief. When they finally pulled apart, the Duke's expression had shifted from joy to determination. We should marry quickly, before Catherine can interfere further, before gossip can do more damage. I will obtain a special license. We can be married within the week. A week? Amelia's mind spun at the speed of it all. Hours ago she had been folding linens. Now she was engaged to a duke and planning a wedding. Is that too soon? I do not wish to rush you, but every day we delay gives opposition time to organize. Catherine is formidable when she sets her mind to something. A week is fine, Amelia said, though her voice trembled slightly. But what of my mother? She cannot travel far, and I will not marry without her present. We will marry here, in Millbrook, the Duke said immediately. In the village church. Your mother will be there, and Edward, and whoever else you wish to invite. I want this marriage to be celebrated, not hidden away, as if we are ashamed. Margaret spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The village will talk regardless. Better to give them something genuine to discuss, than leave them to invent scandals from shadows. The Duke nodded. Precisely. We face this openly, with dignity. Let them see that our love is real and our commitment absolute. A sound from the main room drew their attention. Edward stood in the doorway, the blankets wrapped around him like a cloak, his eyes wide and alert. His hands moved in quick signs. Are you and father getting married? Amelia knelt so she was at his level. Yes. If that is acceptable to you, I know this is sudden, and you may have questions or concerns. Edward's face split into a grin so bright it seemed to illuminate the room. His hands flew through signs almost too fast to follow. You will be my mother, really and truly. If you will have me, Amelia signed back. The boy threw himself into her arms with such force he nearly knocked her over. She held him tightly, feeling his silent laughter shake his small frame. When he pulled back, his hands moved again. I prayed for this. Every night I prayed that father would see what I saw, that you belonged with us. What did you see? Amelia asked, curious. That you made him smile, that you understood me, that you made our small family feel complete. Edward turned to his father, his expression suddenly serious. You will be happy now, father. I know you will. The Duke's voice was thick with emotion. I am already happy, Edward. Thanks to both of you. The storm continued through the night, making travel impossible. The Duke sent a footman, who had been searching in another direction, back to the inn, with word that Edward was safe, and they would return when the weather cleared. Lady Catherine's response, relayed back by the shivering footman, was predictably furious. But in the cottage, insulated by snow and circumstance chance from the outside world's judgment, an unexpected peace settled over them. Margaret directed the sleeping arrangements with gentle authority. Edward would share Amelia's small bed. The Duke would take the chair by the fire, and Amelia would sleep in her mother's room to preserve propriety. As they prepared for sleep, the Duke caught Amelia's hand in the hallway. I know this is not the romantic proposal you might have imagined. No roses, no bended knee in a formal setting. It was perfect, Amelia said honestly. It was real. That matters more than romance. Still, I promise you this. I will spend our marriage making sure you never regret saying yes. I will work every day to be worthy of the gift you have given me. Just love me, Amelia said softly. Love Edward. Build a life with us where sign language is spoken as freely as English, where difference is celebrated rather than hidden. That is all I ask. That, the Duke said. I can promise you absolute. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth flooding through her. Then, with visible reluctance, he released her and returned to his chair by the fire. Amelia lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind howl around the cottage walls. In the bed beside hers, her mother's breathing was labored but steady. Down the hall, Edward slept the deep sleep of a child who finally felt safe. And in the main room, the man she loved kept watch over them all. Everything was about to change. The life she had known, the careful boundaries she had maintained, the expectations she had lived within, all of it would be swept away come morning. There would be battles ahead, struggles she could not yet imagine. Lady Catherine would not accept defeat gracefully. Society would judge and criticize and exclude, but as Amelia finally drifted towards sleep, she felt no fear, only certainty. She had found her place in the world, not through birth or fortune, but through love and courage. She had knelt beside a lonely child and spoken to him in the language he needed. And in doing so, she had found not just purpose, but home. The wedding took place 6 days later in the small stone church at Millbrook's Heart. The building was plain but beautiful in its simplicity, its ancient walls holding centuries of prayers and promises. Amelia wore a dress of pale blue silk, the finest thing she had ever owned, purchased by the Duke from London, and altered to fit by the village seamstress, who had worked through 3 nights to complete it in time. Margaret sat in the front pew, wrapped in shawls against the December cold, her face radiant despite her illness. Edward stood beside his father at the altar, dressed in his own fine suit, his role as witness to the marriage making him glow with importance. His hands moved in constant small gestures, signing his excitement to himself. The village had turned out in force, filling every pew. Some came from genuine goodwill, happy to see their waitress achieve such an impossible elevation. Others came from curiosity, eager to witness the scandal firsthand. And some came with disapproval etched on their faces, convinced they were watching a mockery of proper order. Lady Catherine was notably absent, having left Millbrook the day after the engagement was announced, her parting words to her brother, bitter and unforgiving. But her absence could not diminish the joy of the occasion. The vicar spoke the ancient words, his voice carrying through the hushed church. Amelia repeated her vows clearly, her hand steady in Alexander's as they made their promises before God and community. When the Duke slipped the ring onto her finger, a band of gold set with sapphires that had belonged to his grandmother, she felt the weight of it, both literal and symbolic. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar declared, and the church erupted in a mixture of applause and murmurs. The Duke, her husband, now kissed her gently, a promise of things to come rather than a display for the crowd. When they turned to face the congregation, Edward's hands moved in quick signs that made them both laugh. Finally, I was beginning to think this would take all day. The breakfast that followed was held at the Rosewood Inn, Mrs. Pemberton having insisted on hosting despite the complication. She had prepared a feast that spoke of genuine affection for Amelia, and her speech when she offered it was short but moving. "I have known Amelia Hart since she was a girl," Mrs. Pemberton said, raising her glass. "I have watched her work herself to exhaustion caring for her mother. I have seen her kindness to difficult guests and her patience with everyone who crossed her path. If there was ever a woman who deserved happiness, it is she. Your Grace, you have chosen well. May you both find joy in the years ahead." As the sun set on their wedding day, Amelia stood with Alexander in the inn's garden, watching Edward play in the snow that still covered the ground. Tomorrow they would leave for Wexford Hall, beginning their new life together. There would be challenges, battles with society, with family, with the expectations of a world that did not change easily. But tonight, watching her husband smile as he signed to his son, watching Edward's laughter light up the winter twilight, Amelia felt only gratitude. She had been given a gift she had never dared to hope for. A family bound not by blood but by love, by understanding, by the courage to speak the language each other needed. And that, she thought as Alexander's arm wrapped around her waist and Edward ran toward them with snow-bright cheeks, was worth any price the world might demand.